Hey, tonight we're stepping into the real Wild West. Not the postcard with heroic cowboys and tidy showdowns, but the unforgiving version where survival was never guaranteed. You might think you're tough enough, but out here even a glass of water could be the riskiest decision of your day. Tonight, we drift softly into 1878, the year sound learned to live on wax and fevers haunted the Mississippi Valley. But while the East argued about bridges and bright ideas, some were out west. Something quieter and much harsher was happening. In a small railhead town, Elias Carter moved like a ghost, always counting miles and shade, never trusting a drink poured too fast. While others chased noisy card tables and a crooked piano, he found comfort in small certainties, a cool doorway at noon, a canteen that didn't taste like tin, a seat with a view of the road. This isn't a tale of shootouts or romance. It's the slow rhythm of a day survived by inches, a ladder down into dust, a ledger balanced in lamplight, a whiskey you decide not to finish. Welcome to American Sleepless Story, where forgotten frontiers become quiet rooms you can finally breathe in, and where nothing urgent ever happens. Which is somehow exactly what we needed. If these stories gently pull you in, if they remind you of when boredom had texture and silence had weight, you're already one of us. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. We read them in the quiet hours. Now dim the lights. Let a fan hum if you've got one. And step softly into 1878, a time when every mile was math, every sip a decision, and hope rode at the bottom of a dented canteen. You start before the sun rises, because the road punishes harder at midday. The wagon groans, leather creaks, and dust rises in rolls that dry your throat raw. The water from your barrel ran out yesterday. What you find today comes from a shallow well, tepid and suspicious. Your stomach clenches with each sip, and there are still miles left until the next supply point. To your left, the line of stones shows where others passed. To your right, small improvised crosses tell the silent mathematics of this landscape. There's no romance here, just rhythm, step, breathe, swallow, continue. Your body quickly learns the language of the West. Eat when there is, drink when you can, always distressed. The metallic clink of your canteen against your hip becomes the sleepless soundtrack of American westward movement. The trail stretches ahead like a promise nobody wants to keep. Your boots, which seemed sturdy back in Missouri, now feel thin as paper against the relentless ground. Each step kicks up more of that fine powder that gets into everything your clothes, your food, the corners of your eyes where it mingles with tears you didn't know you were crying. The sun climbs higher, and you can feel it working on your skin like a slow oven, baking away anything soft or comfortable about your former life. Other travelers pass going the opposite direction, their faces telling stories you don't want to read but can't help studying. Some tip their hats, others just stare straight ahead, lost in their own calculations of water and distance. The mathematics of survival out here ain't written in any book you've ever seen. It's written in the hollow sound of empty canteens and the weight of dented metal against tired hips. Your horse, if you're lucky enough to have one, develops a limp by the third day. The blacksmith back in town said the shoes would last, but the blacksmith back in town never walked these particular stones that seem designed to find every weakness in metal and flesh alike. You dismount and walk alongside, which means your water has to stretch even further, each sip becoming a small negotiation with tomorrow's thirst. The animal's eyes hold the same resigned patience you're starting to recognize in your own reflection in muddy puddles. Every mile becomes a negotiation between hope and common sense, between the promise of what lies ahead and the certainty of what lies behind. The sleepy rhythm of walking becomes hypnotic left foot, right foot, breathe through the dust, check the horizon for weather. Your canteen swings with each step, sometimes full enough to slosh, sometimes light enough to feel like carrying empty promises. By afternoon, the heat creates mirages that dance on the trail ahead like some boring story for sleep that your mind insists on telling itself. Lakes that aren't there, trees that vanish when you get close, the occasional shimmer that might be another wagon but turns out to be rocks and wishful thinking. Your mind starts playing tricks too, hearing voices in the wind, imagining the taste of cold water when all you have is warm leather and metal tang. The sun doesn't just heat the air, it seems to extract something essential from everything it touches, leaving behind a sleepy exhaustion that makes every decision feel monumental. Even your thoughts move slower, like honey poured on a winter morning. This is when bad decisions happen, when the next water source seems both impossibly far and absolutely necessary. You remember American towns where water flowed freely from pumps, where the biggest worry was whether your glass was clean enough. The other travelers you meet become temporary family, bound together by shared misery and mutual dependence. There's an unspoken etiquette to trail meetings. Share what you can, ask for what you need. Never stay long enough to become a burden. An old man with callous hands might offer you salt for your blisters. A young woman traveling with her brother might have heard about water 2 days ahead, her voice carrying the particular weariness of someone whose American dream has been ground down to basic survival. These conversations happen in the shade of wagons, voices kept low, as if speaking too loudly may summon more of the endless emptiness that surrounds you. Everyone carries the same haunted look of people who've learned that distance ain't measured in miles, but in small disasters survived. The metallic ping of canteens being refilled from shared wells creates a sleepless symphony of mutual aid. Evening brings its own challenges that would make any sleepless city dweller grateful for walls and roofs. The temperature drops faster than seems possible, and suddenly the clothes that were too heavy at noon become insufficient against the prairie cold that seeps through fabric like cold water through a broken dam. Finding shelter means scanning the horizon for anything that might break the wind, a cluster of rocks, a lone tree, the remains of someone else's camp that tells its own boring story of previous travelers' struggles. You learn to read the signs, where to find dry wood, how to start a fire with damp matches, which direction the wind will shift during the night. Sleep comes in fragments, interrupted by sounds you can't identify and cold that seeps through every layer you own. Your dreams, when they come, are filled with the rhythm of walking and the taste of dusty water, punctuated by the familiar weight of your canteen pressed against your ribs. The morning routine becomes sacred, a ritual that connects you to every other traveler who's ever faced the American West with nothing but determination and poor planning. Check the horse, count the water, study the sky for weather signs, calculate how far you might reasonably travel before the sun makes movement dangerous again. Your possessions shrink to essentials, what you can carry, what you can't afford to lose, what might save your life in an emergency. The mirror you brought from home now seems like an artifact from another civilization, as does the book of poetry and the spare set of Sunday clothes that once seemed so important. Out here, luxury means an extra day's water or a dry place to sleep away from the sleepless wind that never stops moving across the plains. The story of westward expansion, you realize, is really just a very long, very boring story about water management and the weight of metal containers. Every water source becomes a major life event, a chapter in your personal American story that you'll either survive to tell or become part of someone else's cautionary tale. You approach wells and streams with the caution of a diplomat entering hostile territory, never knowing if what you find will sustain you or make you sicker than thirst would. The water might be brackish, contaminated by mining runoff upstream, or simply taste like the metal bucket it's been sitting in for days under the relentless sun. But you drink it anyway, because the alternative is worse, and because your canteen has become more precious than any gold nugget ever panned from these streams. Other travelers gather around these oases like pilgrims, sharing information about the trail ahead, comparing notes on which routes to avoid, which towns might have supplies. These conversations happen in low, careful voices, as if bad news spoken too loudly might follow you down the trail like dust follows a wagon. The landscape itself becomes your enemy and your teacher, offering lessons in humility that no American classroom ever provided. Every hill promises relief on the other side and delivers only another hill, each one looking exactly like the last in that particular way that makes even the sleepless mind question its own sanity. The grass, where it exists, grows in colors that speak of insufficient rain and too much sun, telling its own boring story of survival against impossible odds. Occasional bones horse, cattle, sometimes human mark previous negotiations between ambition and reality, each one a small monument to someone's miscalculation about water, weather, or the simple physics of how much weight a human body can carry across American emptiness. You stop looking too closely at the graves beside the trail. Stop reading the names when you can make them out. The stories they tell are too much like your own. Someone who thought they were stronger than the distance. Someone who calculated wrong about the weight of hope versus the weight of water in a metal canteen. Yet somehow, people keep walking, their footsteps joining the sleepless rhythm of westward movement that has become America's most persistent story. Not because they're brave or foolish, but because stopping ain't really an option once you've committed to this particular chapter of the American experience. The trail has its own momentum, its own logic that becomes clear only after you've surrendered completely to its demands. You learn to find comfort in small things, the cool of pre-dawn air against skin that's forgotten what gentle weather feels like, the satisfaction of a day without major disaster, the sight of smoke on the horizon that might mean other people, other fires, other souls engaged in the same slow-motion bargain with the American West. And somewhere ahead, always ahead, lies the promise that keeps everyone moving that the next town, the next valley, the next horizon might finally deliver what all this walking was supposed to earn. But for those who chose different paths, who traded the endless horizon for the dark certainty of underground tunnels, a different kind of entrance test was just beginning. Thomas descends into the mine on the damp ladder, a candle trembling in his helmet like a prayer flickering in a cathedral made of rock and human ambition. The air grows thick and flowery with each step down, each breath bringing an invisible cloud that settles in places lungs weren't designed to accommodate. His hands remember the shape of every runcalis palms wrapped around wood that's been polished smooth by thousands of other desperate grips, each one belonging to another American story of men trading daylight for the promise of silver buried in the earth. The metallic echo of his boots on iron rungs creates a sleepless rhythm that matches his heartbeat, both growing slower as oxygen becomes a luxury rationed by depth. Below him, the darkness swallows sound the way death swallows hope, leaving only the whisper of settling rock and the distant ping of pickaxes against stone that might or might not hold fortune. The descent feels longer each morning, as if the earth itself is stretching to accommodate more sleepless hours of human burrowing. Thomas carries his father's dented lunch pail, the metal worn smooth in places where nervous fingers have rubbed away the paint, revealing the silver underneath that seems to mock the silver they're all chasing in the tunnels below. Above ground, 1878 America is debating the future of currency, but down here, time moves differently, measured not in presidential terms or congressional sessions, but in the boring story of dust accumulation in human lungs. The candle in his helmet throws shadows that dance like ghosts of miners who came before, each flicker telling its own tale of men who traded surface air for underground wages. By the time his boots touch the tunnel floor, the morning sun feels like a memory from childhood, something bright and warm that happened to someone else in some other American life. The tunnel stretches ahead like a throat that swallowed the many dreams, its walls sweating with moisture that tastes of copper and disappointment. Thomas's hands find the familiar weight of his pickaxe, the handle worn to fit his grip perfectly, a marriage between man and tool that speaks of years spent in this sleepless underground world where day and night lose all meaning. Other miners move past him like shadows with purpose, their faces blackened with the same cold dust that's slowly rewriting the color of Thomas's skin, creating a uniform that can be washed away no matter how much American soap and hot water he applies each evening. The sound of metal striking stone creates a percussion section for the underground orchestra, each strike hoping to hit the note that means silver, that means escape, that means this boring story for sleep might finally have a different ending. The work settles into its familiar rhythm swing. Strike, assess, repeat while Thomas's mind drifts to the surface world he left behind with the sunrise. Up there, people are conducting business in buildings with windows, making decisions in rooms where fresh air moves freely, living American lives that don't require candles strapped to their heads. Down here, the concept of weather becomes academic. It's always the same damp cool, the same recycled air that tastes of human effort and mineral patience. His pickaxe finds its mark again and again, each strike sending vibrations up his arms that he'll feel hours later when he's trying to sleep in a bed that seems to soft after a day spent learning the hardness of rock. The candle on his helmet burns steadily, a small defiance against the darkness that wants to claim everything, casting light on walls that hold secrets older than any American settlement. Midday arrives without announcement in a place where the sun's position means nothing, marked only by the metallic ping of lunch pails opening in unison, creating a sleepless symphony of workers taking their brief respite from the underground economy. Thomas opens his father's old pail to find the same meal he's carried for months bread that's already absorbing the tunnel's dampness, cheese that's learned to taste like the mine itself, and water that carries the metallic tang of pipes that have seen too much use. Around him, other miners share the same ritual, their conversations conducted in voices roughened by dust and effort, discussing the morning's progress in terms of inches gained and hopes maintained. The boring story of mining life unfolds in these moments, not in dramatic cave-ins or silver strikes, but in the daily negotiation between human endurance and geological patience, measured in spoonfuls of food that taste like determination. The afternoon shift brings its own particular fatigue, a weariness that settles into bones like dust settles into fabric gradually, then completely. Thomas's pickaxe feels heavier with each swing, not because the tool has changed, but because his arms are learning the true weight of American ambition when it's measured against actual rock. The tunnel walls seem to press closer as the day progresses, as if the earth itself is growing tired of accommodating human optimism, slowly squeezing back toward its natural state of undisturbed darkness. Other miners move past him with the sleepless determination of men who've calculated that stopping is economically viable, their footsteps creating echoes that bounce off walls until every sound becomes a conversation with the past. The candle flame wavers occasionally, responding to air currents that speak of distant openings, distant sky, distant possibilities that feel as remote as childhood memories. Evening in the mine arrives like a rumor rather than a fact, passed from miner to miner through subtle changes in the work rhythm rather than any visible sign from the world above. Thomas's hands have long since stopped registering the shock of metal meeting stone. They move now with the automatic precision of organs that have learned a new function, adapted to an American life that requires manual negotiation with the underground. His breathing has adjusted too, finding efficiency in air that surface dwellers would consider insufficient, making peace with oxygen rationed by depth and human proximity. The boring story of adaptation writes itself in his lungs, each breath a small victory over conditions that weren't designed for human comfort. When the whistle finally sounds, that distant metallic call that means surface, that means sky, that means the end of another sleepless day spent chasing silver through solid rock, Thomas feels the relief in places he didn't know were tense. The climb back toward daylight reverses the morning's descent, but with a different emotional weight, each rung of the ladder bringing him closer to air that hasn't been breathed by dozens of other men, to space that extends beyond the reach of candle flame. His dented lunch pail feels lighter now, not because it holds less, but because up means hope. Up means the surface world where horizons exist and weather matters, and the sky provides light without needing to be strapped to your forehead. Other miners climb below and above him, creating a sleepless procession of men emerging from the earth-like seeds that have decided to grow in reverse, trading the dark certainty of wages for the uncertain comfort of sunset. The metallic ring of boots on ladder rungs creates a rhythm that speaks of ending, of transition, of the daily resurrection that mining demands from anyone willing to trade daylight for the promise of underground fortune. When Thomas finally reaches surface level, the transition from candlelight to natural light requires adjustment period that speaks to how completely the mine claims its workers, even temporarily. The sun, if it's still visible, feels like a luxury item he'd forgotten he once took for granted, warming skin that spent hours learning the temperature of rock and human effort combined. His first breath of surface air carries flavors the underground doesn't offer: dust that hasn't been filtered through human lungs, moisture that comes from sky rather than seeping walls, the possibility of weather that exists independent of human activity. The American evening spreads before him like a gift he's earned through hours of negotiating with darkness, each moment of remaining daylight feeling precious because he knows exactly what it costs to spend time away from it. But even as he walks home, his hands still remember the weight of the pickaxe, his ears still carry the echo of metal against stone, and his lungs still taste the particular flavor of air that's been shared among desperate men. The evening routine begins with washing, not just cleaning, but the ritual removal of the mind from skin that's absorbed the day's work like a sponge absorbs water. Thomas scrubs his hands with American soap and hot water, watching the basin turn gray with the residue of underground ambition, the physical evidence of another day spent convincing rock to release its secrets. His reflection in the wash basin shows a face that's slowly being rewritten by dust and effort, features grown sharper as the work burns away anything unnecessary for survival. The boring story of mining wages continues in these moments in water that runs gray, in soap that can't quite remove the metallic taste from his mouth, in the knowledge that tomorrow will require the same descent, the same negotiation with darkness, the same faith that underground effort will somehow translate to surface prosperity. But tonight, as he prepares for sleep that will be interrupted by dreams of tunnels and the distant ping of pickaxes, Thomas knows that some men choose different kinds of endurance tests, trading the underground's certainty for the surface world's more visible but equally demanding struggles. They say that on a night when the wind carried more than dust, the saloon served a batch that glowed strange in the lamplight, catching reflections that shouldn't have existed in ordinary glass. Some swore it was meant to give courage before the next day's dangerous work. Others whispered the bottles got switched at the railroad station, mixed up with a shipment bound for somewhere else entirely. The blue tint wasn't obvious at first, just a subtle shimmer that made men squint and look twice, like trying to focus on something at the edge of vision. Lucinda Alvarez had been tending bar long enough to recognize trouble brewing in more than just the coffee pot, but this particular evening felt different, charged with the kind of electricity that makes horses nervous and sleepless dogs pace the alleys. The metallic ping of glasses being set down seemed louder than usual, each sound echoing off walls that had absorbed years of ordinary American conversation but had never heard anything quite like what was coming. The first man to order wasn't anyone special, and just another miner with dust in his hair and silver hopes in his pocket, the kind of customer who made the same boring story for sleep every night, drinking until the underground stopped echoing in his ears. But when Lucinda poured from the suspect bottle, the liquid caught the lamplight in a way that made both of them pause, as if they were witnessing something that belonged more in a medicine show than a frontier saloon. The whiskey moved wrong, too thick for alcohol, too thin for syrup, settling in the glass with patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The miner held it up to the light, watching colors shift through the amber like oil on water, and for a moment the entire saloon grew quiet, that particular American silence that falls when everyone realizes they're about to witness something they'll either remember forever or wish they could forget. When he drank it, The change wasn't immediate, nothing dramatic enough to clear the room or send folks running for the door. Instead, it started as a restlessness that spread from his hands to his arms, a tingling sensation that made him flex his fingers like he was trying to shake off invisible spider webs. Other men, curious about the unusual bottle, ordered their own glasses, and soon half the saloon was nursing drinks that seemed to shimmer with their own internal light. The conversations grew stranger, voices taking on rhythms that didn't match normal speech patterns, as if the words were coming from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. Lucinda watched from behind the bar, her own glass of the mysterious liquor untouched, noticing how the men's eyes began to track movements that weren't there, how their hands moved in response to sensations only they could feel. The sleepless quality of the evening became apparent as the night wore on, with customers who should have been stumbling home instead sitting straighter in their chairs, their attention focused on things that existed just beyond the reach of lamplight. One man spent an hour describing the intricate patterns he could see in the wood grain of his table, tracing designs with his finger while explaining a geometric complexity that ordinary pine planks certainly didn't possess. Another became convinced that the metallic sounds coming from the kitchen were actually messages being tapped out in some elaborate code, and he sat perfectly still, listening with the intensity of a telegraph operator receiving urgent news. The boring story of a typical saloon evening transformed into something altogether more peculiar, as if the blue whiskey had unlocked a different frequency of American frontier experience. Lucinda found herself caught between her professional obligation to serve customers and her growing concern about the bottle's contents, which seemed to affect different men in different ways. Some became extraordinarily focused on minute details, counting and recounting the coins in their pockets, examining their fingernails as if they contained secrets, studying the flame of oil lamps with the dedication of scientists conducting important research. Others grew restless in ways that went beyond ordinary drunkenness, pacing the saloon floor with energy that seemed both purposeful and directionless, like men who'd received urgent instructions but couldn't quite remember what they were supposed to do. The atmosphere grew thick with concentration and confusion, a mixture that made even sober observers feel like they were witnessing something significant, though nobody could quite articulate what that something might be. As midnight approached, the effects seemed to intensify rather than fade, which wasn't how alcohol typically worked in anyone's experience. Men who'd been sitting quietly suddenly became aware of sounds coming from impossible directions, voices from empty rooms, footsteps on roofs, conversations happening just beyond the range of normal hearing. The sleepless energy in the room took on a different quality, less like intoxication and more like a heightened awareness that made everything seem simultaneously more important and more mysterious. Lucinda noticed that her own untouched glass seemed to be changing color slightly, the blue tint becoming more pronounced as the night progressed, as if the liquid itself was responding to some unseen influence. She began to suspect that whatever was in that bottle wasn't meant for human consumption, at least not in the quantities these men were consuming it. The strangest part wasn't the immediate effects, but how they seemed to follow patterns that suggested something other than random intoxication. Men began reporting similar visions, geometric shapes moving behind their eyelids, the sensation of tiny creatures crawling along their skin, the conviction that they could understand conversations happening in languages they'd never heard. The metallic taste that followed each sip wasn't unpleasant, exactly, but it lingered in ways that ordinary whiskey never did, coating their tongues with flavors that seemed to shift and change long after the glass was empty. Some described it as tasting like pennies left in rainwater. Others swore it carried hints of something medicinal, something that belonged more in a doctor's bag than a bartender's stock. The boring story of frontier drinking was being rewritten in real time, page by page, sip by sip. By dawn, most of the affected men had simply left. Not stumbling drunk, not passed out in corners, but quietly departing with the focused determination of people who'd suddenly remembered important appointments elsewhere. They paid their tabs without argument, gathered their belongings with unusual care, and walked out into the morning light with expressions that suggested they were processing experiences that didn't fit into their usual categories of understanding. Lucinda found herself alone with a saloon full of empty glasses that still held traces of the mysterious blue tint, and a bottle that was now completely clear as if whatever had given it that strange glow had been consumed along with its contents. The silence felt different too, not just quiet, but expectant, as if the building itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The bottle disappeared that morning, and Lucinda never spoke about where it went or how it vanished from her carefully organized inventory. Some said she buried it behind the saloon, others claimed she threw it down the town's deepest well. The men who'd been affected returned to their normal routines, working in the mines, frequenting the saloon, conducting their usual American frontier business, but with a subtle difference that was hard to define and impossible to measure. They seemed more attentive to details that others missed, more aware of patterns in everyday occurrences, more willing to consider possibilities that lay outside the boundaries of conventional frontier wisdom. The sleepless quality that had marked that particular evening seemed to have left a permanent impression, as if they'd been introduced to a different way of perceiving the world around them. The truth about the blue whiskey remained buried as deep as any silver vein, protected by the kind of silence that frontier communities reserved for events that didn't fit into their standard collection of stories. Lucinda continued serving drinks with her usual efficiency, but some customers noticed that she occasionally paused before pouring, holding bottles up to the light as if checking for things that shouldn't be there. The boring story of frontier life resumed its normal pace, but with an undercurrent of awareness that some mysteries were better left unsolved, some questions better left unasked. In a place where survival often depended on accepting the unknown rather than investigating it, the night of the blue whiskey became just another piece of local lore, something that might have happened, probably did happen, but definitely wasn't the kind of thing you discussed with strangers or included in letters home to family who still believed the West was all cowboys and cattle drives. Next to the general store, where beans and nails shared shelf space with equal dignity, a door draped in. Faded red curtains maintained its own separate schedule, operating according to rhythms that had nothing to do with sunrise or sunset. Women moved past with measured steps, their dresses colored in shades that had once been bright but were now softened by frontier dust and endless washing, their hair pinned with ribbons that told stories of careful preservation and hopeful presentation. For many men in this sleepless American town, that doorway represented companionship in a land where letters took months to arrive and embraces were rarer than silver strikes. For the women behind those curtains, it meant survival in a world mapped by others, drawn according to rules they hadn't written but had learned to navigate with the same skill miners used to read rock formations. The metallic sound of coins changing hands created its own quiet percussion, a financial transaction that carried emotional weight no bank ledger could properly record. The contrast between the two worlds wasn't marked by distance. Barely 50 feet separated the bordello from the nearest family dwelling, but by the careful choreography that allowed both to exist without acknowledging each other during daylight hours. Wives hanging laundry on Monday mornings developed a particular way of not seeing certain windows, while their husbands learned the art of studying their boots when passing certain doorways. Children played in streets that somehow managed to have invisible boundaries, games that naturally steered away from particular porches without anyone ever explaining why. The boring story of frontier coexistence wrote itself in these small avoidances, these tiny negotiations that allowed a community to function despite containing lives that couldn't officially intersect. Even the town's single church bell seemed to ring with deliberate timing, its call to Sunday service echoing just loud enough to be heard by everyone, just soft enough to avoid sounding judgmental. Miss May moved through this carefully constructed social geography with the grace of someone who understood exactly where all the invisible lines were drawn and how to step carefully around them. Her morning routine included sweeping the front steps, not because they were particularly dirty, but because the ritual of public maintenance declared her establishment's commitment to being a good neighbor, even if that neighborliness came with conditions. She knew which shopkeepers would nod politely when she came to buy supplies, which ones would serve her efficiently, but silently, and which ones would find sudden reason to be busy in the back room when she approached their counters. The American frontier had created its own complex etiquette around services that everyone needed but nobody wanted to discuss, and Miss May had become fluent in the language of respectful distance that kept the community functioning. The women who worked in the red curtain rooms came from the same circumstances that brought everyone else to frontier towns' economic necessity. Family disasters, the simple mathematics of survival in a country that offered limited options for those without inherited advantages. Some had been school teachers whose schools closed when mining towns went bust. Others had been shop girls whose shops burned down. Still others had made the calculation that selling companionship was more reliable than hoping for marriage proposals from men who might not survive their next shift underground. Their conversations, conducted in voices kept low enough to respect the thin walls, often focused on the same practical concerns that occupied their more conventional neighbors: the price of fabric, the reliability of mail delivery, the quality of water coming from the town well. The sleepless nature of their work schedule meant they were often awake when the rest of the town slept, witnessing the frontier's quieter hours when honest businesses closed their doors and left the streets to moonlight and possibility. The economics of both worlds intersected in ways that nobody discussed but everyone understood. The miners who frequented Miss May's establishment were the same men whose wages supported the general store, whose custom kept the saloon profitable, whose presence made the town viable enough to attract the families who gave it respectability. The wives who pointedly ignored certain transactions were married to men whose underground work created the silver that eventually found its way into everyone's pockets, including those of women who traded different services for the same metal. The boring story of frontier capitalism included chapters that didn't appear in newspaper accounts sent back east, but which were essential to understanding how these remote American communities actually functioned when stripped of the romance that distance and time tend to add to difficult truths. Disease moved through both worlds with the democratic efficiency that characterized most frontier hardships, recognizing no boundaries between respectable and disreputable, between married and unmarried, between those who earned their living in daylight and those who worked by lamplight. The town's single doctor found himself treating ailments that require discretion alongside injuries that could be discussed openly, managing a practice that demanded medical expertise and social diplomacy in equal measure. Patent medicines promised miraculous cures for conditions that couldn't be named in polite company, their advertisements carefully worded to suggest relief without specifying symptoms. The metallic taste of mercury-based treatments was familiar to women on both sides of the social divide, though for different reasons and with different levels of shame attached to the necessity of seeking such remedies. Sunday mornings created the week's most complex social choreography, as the same community that had carefully ignored certain activities for 6 days attempted to gather in a single building for collective worship. Families arrived in clothes that had been saved for the occasion, their children scrubbed clean and reminded about proper behavior in God's house. The women from behind the red curtains generally found other activities to occupy their Sunday mornings, understanding that their absence was a gift they could give to the community's need for moral clarity 1 day per week. The preacher, who was not naive about the realities of frontier life, crafted sermons that addressed sin in general terms while avoiding specifics that might make anyone uncomfortable about their neighbors. The sleepless quality of frontier existence meant that even religious observance had to accommodate the practical reality that not everyone's week followed the same moral or economic schedule. The children growing up in this environment learned to navigate contradictions that would have puzzled their grandparents in more settled communities. They understood that certain adults existed in different categories without being able to articulate what those categories meant or why they mattered. Boys approaching adulthood received educational experiences that their mothers pretended not to know about, while girls approaching womanhood learned lessons about reputation and consequence that nobody wanted to explain directly. The American frontier was teaching an entire generation that survival sometimes required accepting realities that couldn't be discussed in polite company, that communities could function despite containing elements that officially didn't exist. These children would grow up with a practical understanding of human nature that was both broader and more forgiving than what their Eastern cousins received from formal education. The seasonal rhythms of mining affected both worlds in ways that tied their separate economies together more tightly than either side preferred to acknowledge. When the mines were producing well, both the general store and the Red Curtain establishment saw increased business, as men with silver in their pockets spent it on different forms of comfort and companionship. When mining slowed, both sides of the social divide felt the economic pressure, leading to quiet negotiations about extended credit and deferred payments that created relationships more complex than simple commerce. Miss May found herself extending the same kind of community support that wives provided to struggling families, offering meals to men who couldn't afford full services, providing a warm place to sit for those who simply needed somewhere to be that wasn't an empty mining camp bunk. The boring story of frontier mutual aid included chapters that wouldn't be preserved in official histories, but were essential to understanding how these communities survived their harshest periods. Winter brought everyone indoors and created a different set of social dynamics, as the enforced proximity of small buildings and limited social spaces made the careful avoidance strategies of warmer months more difficult to maintain. The same snowstorms that kept families huddled around their stoves also drove men to seek warmth and company wherever they could find it, leading to conversations and connections that the more formal social structure usually prevented. Women who normally existed in separate spheres found themselves sharing space in the general store during blizzards, united by the common experience of trying to stretch supplies until spring made travel possible again. These moments of forced equality created bonds that officially didn't exist, but practically speaking made the difference between survival and disaster when frontier communities faced their greatest challenges. As winter deepened and the sleepless wind howled around buildings that housed such different but interdependent American stories, the artificial boundaries between respectability and necessity began to seem as temporary as the snow that would eventually melt, revealing the same muddy ground beneath everyone's feet. The Wild West that Hollywood would later romanticize operated on a sleepless mathematical precision that would have impressed any Eastern accountant, if accountants had been brave, enough to venture into territories where ledger books were kept in saddlebags and receipts were carved into tree bark. Every decision in 1878 frontier life came down to calculations that city dwellers never had to make. How many bullets versus how much bacon? How much water versus how many miles? How many days of safety versus how many nights of profit? The American frontier ran on numbers that mattered more than any stock exchange, the boring story of survival written in quantities of beans, and the metallic weight of coins that could mean the difference between making it through winter and becoming another unmarked grave beside a nameless trail. These weren't the dramatic showdowns of dime novels, but the quiet arithmetic of people trying to stretch insufficient resources across impossible distances. The average frontier town of this era lasted exactly 18 months before either growing into something permanent or disappearing entirely, leaving behind nothing but foundation stones and the occasional rusted piece of mining equipment. The mathematics were brutally simple. A town needed at least 47 adult males to support one general store, 63 to justify a saloon, and 91 to make a church economically viable, though churches often appeared much earlier because hope, unlike commerce, didn't require a sustainable customer base. Most settlements never reached these magical numbers, existing in a sleepless state of perpetual uncertainty where every departing family brought the community closer to the mathematical tipping point between viability and abandonment. The metallic sound of hammer on nail that marked construction was often followed, months later, by the same sound marking deconstruction as useful lumber was salvaged for the next attempt at permanent civilization somewhere else down the line. Water dominated every calculation in ways that would have shocked Americans living near rivers or lakes, with frontier communities measuring prosperity not in gold or silver, but in gallons per person per day. The average mining operation required 11 gallons of water for every ounce of precious metal extracted, meaning that successful mines were often located not where the ore was richest, but where water was most reliably available. Towns sprang up around springs, the way eastern cities developed around harbors, with the boring story of frontier expansion actually being a story about hydrology and the American obsession with making dry places profitable. Wells were community investments that required mathematical cooperation, each family contributing according to a formula that considered family size, anticipated usage, and distance from the proposed well site, creating social contracts more complex than many business partnerships. The economics of frontier prostitution followed predictable patterns that varied by season, mining success, and proximity to railroad construction, with prices fluctuating according to supply and demand principles that would have made Adam Smith proud. A working woman in a successful mining town could earn in one night what a school teacher made in a month, but only during boom periods that rarely lasted longer than 2 years. The mathematics of the profession included calculating the cost of medical care, the probability of violence, and the statistical likelihood of finding alternative employment before age and circumstances made the work impossible. Miss May and women like her weren't just providing services. They were running small businesses with overhead costs, employee management, and long-term financial planning that required the same entrepreneurial skills as any other frontier enterprise, though their business plans couldn't be discussed in polite American society. Railroad construction created temporary economic ecosystems that moved across the landscape like slow-motion storms, bringing sudden prosperity followed by equally sudden abandonment. A railroad construction crew of 300 men could transform an empty prairie into a bustling town in 6 weeks, then move on and leave behind a ghost town in 6 more. The sleepless energy of railroad building operated on mathematical schedules that ignored local convenience crews had to lay a specific number of miles per month to meet construction deadlines, and towns that couldn't adapt to railroad timing simply got left behind. The metallic rhythm of hammers driving railroad spikes created temporary American communities that existed for exactly as long as it took to build the next section of track. Their entire economic structure designed to be portable and profitable for precisely the duration of the construction contract. Disease spread through frontier communities according to mathematical models that nobody understood but everyone experienced, with typhoid, cholera, and dysentery following predictable patterns based on population density, water quality, and seasonal migration routes. The average frontier doctor served a territory of approximately 400 square miles and could be expected to lose 1 patient out of every 3 to diseases that were easily treatable in cities with proper medical facilities. Patent medicine sales followed boom and bust cycles that mirrored mining activity, with snake oil salesmen appearing in town exactly 2 weeks after news of a silver strike reached the nearest telegraph office. The boring story of frontier medicine was written in statistics that revealed the true cost of American expansion. For every mile of track laid or acre of land claimed, a certain percentage of human life was simply factored into the equation, an acceptable loss. The mathematics of frontier violence were less dramatic, but more deadly than popular imagination suggested, with most deaths resulting not from gunfights, but from accidents, disease, and the simple physics of working with dangerous equipment under difficult conditions. Mine cave-ins killed more men than outlaws ever did, and contaminated water claimed more lives than bullets. The average frontier cemetery contained graves in a ratio that told the real story of westward expansion. 3 deaths from disease for every death from violence, to deaths from accidents for every death from natural causes, and 1 grave for every successful person who managed to establish permanent residence. These weren't the exciting statistics that sold newspapers back east, but they were the sleepless reality that governed daily life for Americans brave or desperate enough to stake their futures on frontier possibilities. Whether patterns created their own mathematical challenges, with frontier communities learning to calculate survival odds based on seasonal variations that could make the difference between prosperity and disaster. The average prairie winter lasted for months and 3 days, required approximately 14 cords of wood per family for heating, and could be expected to isolate communities from outside contact for periods ranging from 6 weeks to 3 months depending on snowfall and wind patterns. Spring flooding followed mathematical models based on winter snow accumulation and spring temperature rises, with communities that ignored hydrology statistics often finding themselves literally underwater when the calculations caught up with reality. The metallic sound of wind through poorly chinked cabin walls became a seasonal soundtrack that reminded everyone of the numerical relationship between preparation and survival. The social mathematics of frontier communities operated according to unwritten formulas that determined everything from marriage prospects to business partnerships, with success often depending more on understanding these invisible calculations than on individual talent or ambition. A single woman over 25 had a statistical marriage probability that decreased by 7% for every additional year of age, while a man with a steady income and no obvious vices could expect to receive marriage proposals at a rate of approximately 1 every 6 months. The boring story of frontier romance was actually a story about demographic mathematics and the American belief that love, like everything else, could be improved through proper calculation and strategic planning. These weren't the passionate romances of literature, but practical partnerships designed to pool resources and increase survival odds for both parties and any children who might result from the arrangement. By 1879, the mathematical inevitability of frontier change was becoming apparent to anyone willing to examine the statistics rather than believe the romantic stories. Railroad completion would eliminate most freight hauling jobs. Improved mining techniques would require fewer workers, and agricultural development would attract families that would gradually outnumber and outlast the temporary population of miners, gamblers, and entrepreneurs who had created the first version of Western American civilization. The sleepless energy that had driven frontier expansion was already beginning to settle into the more predictable rhythms of established communities, where success would be measured not in ounces of silver extracted or miles of dangerous trail survived, but in the boring story of ordinary American prosperity. Children attending school regularly, businesses operating year-round, and wells that provided clean water without requiring daily prayers for their continued function. The mathematics of survival were slowly giving way to the mathematics of civilization, and somewhere in that transition, the Wild West was becoming simply the American West, trading adventure for stability, one calculated decision at a time. As the last embers of frontier campfires fade into the American night, we're left with something quieter than legend, something more enduring than gold strikes or railroad fortunes, the simple mathematics of human persistence in places where persistence was the only currency that mattered. Tonight we've walked alongside Elias Carter as he learned that survival meant calculating water against distance. Watched Thomas O'Rourke trade daylight for the sleepless promise of silver buried in reluctant rock. Witnessed the mysterious blue whiskey that revealed how thin the line was between medicine and madness in places where both were equally scarce. The boring story of the American frontier wasn't written in dramatic showdowns or sudden wealth. It was inscribed in the daily arithmetic of making do with less, of finding community in unlikely places, of accepting that respectability and necessity sometimes required the same roof, but different rooms. These weren't the heroes of dime novels, but ordinary people engaged in the extraordinary task of building civilization one careful decision at a time. Their lives measured not in grand gestures, but in small victories over distance, weather, and the simple physics of staying alive in places that seemed designed to test human stubbornness against geological patience. Tonight, in your warm bed with clean water, flowing from nearby taps and electric lights that respond to the flip of a switch, you can appreciate luxuries that Elias, Thomas, Lucinda, and Miss May would have considered miraculous. The metallic taste of frontier water has been replaced by fluoride and safety regulations. The sleepless anxiety of calculating survival odds has given way to different worries that, while real, rarely involve wondering whether tomorrow's water will be clean enough to drink. The mathematical precision that governed frontier life, how much bacon versus how many bullets, how many miles versus how much hope, has been replaced by different calculations, but the fundamental human drive to make it through another day remains beautifully, boringly the same. The Wild West became the American West not through dramatic transformation, but through the accumulated weight of ordinary days, each one adding another layer of civilization over the raw mathematics of survival. The communities that lasted were the ones that learned to balance necessity with aspiration, that found ways to accommodate both the respectable and the necessary, that understood survival required cooperation when cooperation meant looking the other way at convenient moments. Their story reminds us that progress isn't always exciting sometimes. It's just the quiet satisfaction of having enough water for everyone, enough wood for winter, enough trust to sleep soundly knowing your neighbors are invested in the same boring project of making tomorrow slightly more predictable than today. So tell me, fellow sleepless travelers, what period of American history would you like to explore next? The forgotten mathematics of Civil War field hospitals, the quiet desperation of Dust Bowl farm wives, the beautifully mundane details of life during the Great Depression when everyone became an expert in making do with less. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let our community of insomniacs know what historical stories help you find peace in the small hours when modern anxieties feel too large for comfort. If tonight's journey into the past helps slow your mind's restless calculations, consider subscribing to American Sleepless Story and turning on notifications so you'll know when we post our next exploration of history's quiet corners. We're building a community of people who find comfort in the unhurried pace of bygone eras, who understand that sometimes the most profound stories are the ones where nothing particularly exciting happens, but everything somehow matters more because of that beautiful, boring attention to the details that made survival possible. Sweet dreams, and remember, in a world that moves at frontier pace, even sleep comes more naturally when you're not rushing toward tomorrow, but simply grateful to have made it through today. Rest well, knowing that your ancestors solved harder problems with fewer resources, and that their patient mathematics of survival created the foundation for every comfortable night's sleep you'll ever have.